Okay, Old Main is just rung 10 times. It's 10 a.m. And welcome to, I can't believe it's already the 9th installment of Honors College Forum Pandemic. And we're taking quite a different turn today, moving from the 14th century right up until May 20th, 2020, with the most recent economic data from a trio of experts. And they are each going to speak, and I'm going to introduce all of them right now in the order of their presentations. So up first, the Honors College very own Associate Dean, Jennie Popp, who's also a professor of agricultural economics and agribusiness. In the Honors College, she basically runs the show, earning the nickname Boss. She oversees our study abroad grant programs, which is huge, and also our extensive research grant programs, both for faculty and students. On top of it, she has another job running service learning across campus for honors and non-honor students. Her research focuses on assessment of best practices for farmers, directed to environmental and financial sustainability goals. So Dr. Popp will be our first presenter, followed by Professor D. Fang, who received a PhD in business administration, agribusiness, from W.P. Carey School of Business at Arizona State University. Dr. Fang received her BS in economics from Nankai University in China. Fang's research focuses on food and health economics, consumer economics, and marketing, and issues related to childhood obesity. Her publications have appeared in Main Street Economics, Agricultural Economics, and medical fields. Her research has been funded by the National Bureau of Economic Research. She's an active member of Agricultural and Applied Economics Association and the American Public Association. And our third presenter, who will be joining us from London, is Dr. John Cairns, a professor of health economics at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. Professor Cairns was also a lecturer in the Department of Economics at the University of Aberdeen in Scotland, where he directed the Health Economics Research Unit and held an endowed professorship. He's had numerous honors and professional service roles, including the Scottish Medicines Consortium. He was a health economist on the National Advisory Committee on Safety of Blood, Tissues, and Organs. He also chaired the DH Cost Effectiveness Methodology for immunization programs and procurements. So we have quite a distinguished triumvirate of economists, and they're going to zoom in on all the implications for the global economy of this great pandemic. So I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Popp, and I will mute myself.
Thank you, Dean Kuhn. For anybody who follows economics, you know this is really unusual times for us. Information is changing daily, and as such, so do our predictions. So instead of trying to predict too much about what's going on in the future, we're going to focus in today, at least in my part, on what is actually happening now. And I'm going to invite you to follow along with me this summer to see what happens in the future. Now, when we try to look at economic impacts, we use what we call economic indicators to measure them. There's lots of different economic indicators, but I'm only going to focus on 3 of them today. They're imperfect. Nothing measures anything perfectly, but they're what we have, so we're going to use them today. The first one I'm going to talk about is the stock market indices. Now, if you listen to the news, you hear about the Dow Jones and the NASDAQ and the S&P. And basically, the reason we use them is they reflect what's happening in the world and business at any given time. Now, of course, there are stocks that don't run exactly with the market. They can run counter to the market. But in general, when the market is up, the economy is considered to be doing well. When the market is down, the economy is considered not to be doing well. The next indicator we have is what we call the unemployment rate. And in order to calculate the unemployment rate, we need a couple of pieces of information. Now, excuse my simplified graphics, but hopefully it'll get the message across. The first piece we need is what we call the labor force. And we define the labor force as those people who have jobs and those that are actively seeking work. Now, let's just assume for this example that the top 2 rows of people have jobs. They're what we call the employed. The bottom people don't have a job. They're the unemployed. So to get to the unemployment rate, we take the total number of people not employed divided by the total labor force, and we get the unemployment rate. Now, an unemployment rate of 33% is enough to make an economist's eyes burn. That's really high, but we're just going to use that for our example today. Now, as I said, though, the unemployment rate isn't exactly a perfect measurement because in addition to the labor force and the unemployed, we have this group of people we call discouraged workers. And discouraged workers are those that are able to work, but they're stopped looking for work. They may have stopped because the type of work that they need is no longer needed, or they've just looked so long that they've given up. They're really unemployed, right? So if we had included them in our unemployment numbers, they would be higher. Last slide was 33%. This is 50%. So when I talk a little later about our unemployment numbers, know they're probably underestimating what's really happening in the economy. Right, the last indicator we're going to use is called the GDP, or gross domestic product, which is calculated as the sum of goods and services in an economy in any given time period. We typically measure it over a year. And if you look at this pie graph here, it shows typically that GDP is measured by 2/3 of its consumption. And that's going to be important when we see what Dr. Fang has to present for us later. But just like the other measures, they're not perfect either. GDP can't be considered a measure of really good measure of economic well-being because it doesn't count anything. Think about the time that you babysat for your next door neighbor, and when your time was up, the parent gave you some cash and you moved on. That's not included in GDP because that money doesn't go through a formalized market. It also assumes that any kind of spending is a good thing. Now, we spend money to fight crime and fight drugs, and thanks to a hailstorm last week, I have to spend money to fix a roof. That's not good spending, but it's included as increasing GDP, and so GDP may in some cases both underestimate and overestimate how well an economy is doing. So how do you like that? In just a matter of mere minutes, we've gone through some basic macroeconomic lessons, and now we're ready to use that information to see what's happened in the economy. I turned in my part of the slides just 48 or 72 hours ago, and what you're going to find is some of my information is already outdated, but I'll try to bring you up to speed with what's changed in the last few days. So the first slide I'm showing here is a depiction of what's happened with the Dow Jones Industrial Average since February 19th, when it hit its peak. Now, I could have used the S&P or the NASDAQ, and it would have given me more or less the same type of reflection in the market. But let's see how the Dow is reflecting what's happened in the economy. Back up here in mid-February, as I said, the Dow hit its high. Things were going great. But after that, things started to slump as the U.S. started getting worried about COVID. We weren't fitting. We didn't have too many of our problems here yet, but we were worried about what was happening in Asia and in Europe. So in early February, the Fed cut interest rates, which basically makes it easier for the banks to lend out money to people and businesses in order to help jumpstart the economy. So that, as you can see, led the market to go up. Well, at the same time that COVID was happening, that meant that business was slowing down in Europe and Asia. And when that happens, the demand for oil slows down. And as the price of oil falls, that makes people realize that the economy is slowing down, and it makes people nervous. But in addition to that, our buddies here, who are big leaders in oil around the world, got into a little bit of a fight. And we had an oil war break out in early March because they couldn't agree on the pricing. That happened on a weekend, and by March 9th, when the stock market opened that day, we had the biggest one-day drop in the stock market in history. Okay, so that's not real good. That made everybody nervous. And then we still have problems with COVID becoming more and more evident in the US, and the United States taking more and more action to try to address it. Well, the Fed jumped in again, and they had another emergency meeting and they reduced interest rates to zero, basically begging banks and businesses to do something to help jumpstart the economy. Again, we got a little pickup from that, but as you can see, greater worries about COVID and the slowing down of economies and the closing of states really led the stock market to fall. Now, we're still in the middle of a pandemic, aren't we? It's really hit the US after mid-March. So why would the stock market go up? Well, in part, some of that can be explained by the fact that things are looking better in other parts of the world. Asia is back to business more than we are, so is parts of Europe, and that leads people to be more optimistic about what might happen in the future. Now, will this trend continue? I don't know. We'll have to wait and see. So after just explaining that the market has been up and down and mainly down from where it had been, the big bad news is the unemployment rate. You can see in February we were hovering around 3%. By March it had jumped up a little, and the April estimates were horrible, 14 and 12% for our state. Now remember, this unemployment rate doesn't count those discouraged workers. Just this weekend, our Secretary of Treasury said that we may actually be in the 20s, 25% in some states when you count those discouraged workers. How does that translate in terms of loss of jobs? Well, I've graphed on here going back from January 2010, all of this job creation we had over the decade, and a myriad time of 2 months we've lost almost every job in terms of numbers, that is, that we created in the last decade, and that's pretty dire. But those losses aren't equal in every sector. This graph shows you, if you move to the left, the dots where they move further to the left are the areas that have been most hit by unemployment. And we can see that service sectors such as restaurants and barber shops, as well as leisure and hospitality, think of the airlines and any kind of tourist operation, has been hit really hard. And because these impacts are not equal across sectors, and because sectors are not equal across states, different states have been hit harder than others. So here's a map that came out a full month ago, and this showed about what unemployment rates look like around the nation in different states. The darker the color blue, the worse the unemployment. And we can see states like Nevada and Hawaii and Louisiana that have a lot of emphasis on tourism were hit hard pretty early. Pennsylvania, another one, not as big in terms of tourism, but they were one of the first states to shut down. So we saw unemployment growing in those states quicker. Now, I encourage you all to look at the release that comes out from the Bureau of Labor Services this Friday. It will update this map for May. And I was going to do it myself and kind of get an idea based on what I had read. But this next slide might help you understand why I didn't want to do that. Here is a couple of graphs about how economists have looked at unemployment and unemployment rates in the state of Arkansas for the last couple of months. Now, we saw COVID, it started in February in terms of the news, and economists realized by March that, it was going to have an impact in our state. So if you look at the orange line here, we see that economists had assumed that the employment numbers would fall a little and unemployment rates would go up. But we've gotten more and more information, and the broader the impacts that we learn about make us realize that our projections for unemployment were way underestimated. So by May, some of the economists were estimating that we are going to peak in our state in unemployment in the third quarter. So by end of summer, we will have reached our highest unemployment rates that can be getting close to 20%. And they'll fall, we see, or we're projecting them to see by that same time next year, but we're still going to be worse off than we were before this pandemic started. The last economic indicator we wanted to talk about was GDP. No surprise that GDP has fallen. But to read this graph, notice that 0 here represents the the baseline, and this is a percent change in GDP from the preceding quarter. So this means anything above zero means the economy was growing. Now, some periods were growing quicker than others, but this still is a period of growth. And we grew all along until the most recent quarter, and we dropped a lot, 4.8% in the nation. Now, something that's really important to remember is that about at least half of this period, the economy was chugging along great. We were still in that high period, but the negative impacts of COVID in March outweighed all the good things that had happened in the economy in January. So we're a little nervous to see what this is going to look like the next period. And for those of you who have studied basic economics, you know that when we report 2 periods or 2 quarters consecutively of negative growth, the economy is considered in a recession. Now, where did those changes happen? You can look and see that from the last quarter in orange to the current quarter in blue, everything has fallen except government spending. Well, just like we said, spending money to combat crime or fix a roof is not necessarily a good thing that improves the economy. Neither is spending that $2.3 trillion to try to help the economy. So GDP may be underestimating just what the damages were this last quarter. Now we're going to switch gears a little bit and talk about Arkansas agriculture and why. Because Arkansas's agriculture is very important to our state GDP. More important here than in other states in the South and for the average of the U.S. Together, the direct impacts of agriculture and the economic activity it generates in other sectors make up about 16% or 1/6 of our economy. So it's important to know if things are going wrong in the agricultural world. Because I only have a limited amount of time, we're going to briefly talk about what's happened in the crops and animal sector. Now, for anybody who knows agriculture, it is a risky business to begin with. The weather, Mother Nature can come in and in one full swoop with a tornado wipe out an entire crop. And for added fun this year, row crop and specialty crop producers are dealing with worker shortages. Particularly for specialty crops, a lot of producers rely on migrant workers that come in temporarily from other countries through the H-2A visa program. Well, the number of workers coming in this year is greatly reduced from before. And you couple that with workers that were already here that have either fallen ill to COVID or can't work because they have nobody to take care of their children. That means less workers to plant crops and harvest crops, and that means that there's going to be major crop loss. And in addition to that, we have food losses due to COVID directly. About half of our food is destined for markets such as restaurants, hotels, and schools. And those markets have gone away. So a lot of crop producers and other types of producers are finding nobody or no market for their products. Some may have a little longer shelf life. Let's look at milk and beer, for example, but milk that's packaged in little cartons for school kids can't easily be repackaged into gallons to sell in a supermarket. Same with beer. So not only are producers finding losses, but so are the retailers and wholesalers that sell their products. Now, the meat sector, I'm sure this comes as no surprise to anybody. There's been a lot of news about the plant closures across the nation. Back in April, the CDC looked at illness, the COVID-related illness in 119 plants, and they found about 4,000 people had become ill and 20 people had died. And during that time, of course, the plants were well aware of this, and slowly but surely, a lot of them were either reducing the amount of services coming out of there or closing down temporarily completely. And that, of course, is going to have a negative impact on the amount of meat available. Here's a graph that I put together that shows in blue cattle slaughters, in orange hog slaughters, and in the gray the chicken. And economists do things a weird way. What we've done is we've compared every week this year since January to the overall average of weekly averages last year to get an indication of how much production we have going through those plants. And 100% means that we did exactly what we did on average last year. At the beginning of the year, you can see that a lot of these numbers were above last year's production levels. But then with COVID and the start of the plant closures, you can see that cattle and hogs have really fallen off for a period. Poultry not near as badly, but they too had fallen below the average of last year. And what did this translate to? Well, this is a picture I took just last week in my local supermarket. Finding beef and pork in particular can be difficult. The chicken producers in Arkansas have not had a slowdown, which is good, but in other parts of the nation, we have seen it. Now, this is a blank slide, and it's not, it won't stay blank for a while, but I want you to just stop for a minute and think about those consequences of what happens when the supply chain breaks. Dean Waller and others tomorrow will talk about it, but you've all seen these headlines that have come out about farmers that are having to slaughter pigs or abort them or slaughter cattle with nowhere to go. And this is devastating. And from a consumer perspective and just anybody who's got a heart, this is absolutely horrible. But do realize that no matter, even though this is not just economically devastating for a farmer, it's heartbreaking and emotionally challenging and causing all sorts of terrible ripples in the parts of the nation that this is happening. I do want you to know that not every state, not every farmer is having to do this, but for those that are, it is terrible. So at this point, you say, thanks a lot, Dr. Popp. You've really made things sound like doom and gloom. We just had that's a great depressing way to start our day. But in brief, we do have some good news. As you know, Congress passed and the president signed the CARES Act that offers $2.3 trillion to try to address some of these issues. In Arkansas, we've received $1.25 billion. Some of it has gone for unemployment insurance, others to business trying to keep people employed. Education, including the University of Arkansas, has received money, and the money that's come to the university, half of that has been allocated directly to students, and they've already received their payments. More and more programs are being started. Sarah Huckabee Sanders started the Arkansas 30-Day Fund, and this is giving loans to small businesses who are waiting for assistance from the CARES Act. So lots of little things happening to try to improve the economy and get us going. Now here's a map that I took on Saturday that is now outdated because it shows a few states that have not reopened. But as of today, every state has reopened at least in part. Now, what this is going to mean for the economy, we're going to have to wait and see. But I encourage you to follow more about what's happening in the economy. Here are some really good sites that I suggest you look at. I want to give a real shout out to the folks I work with in the Department of Agricultural Economics and Agribusiness, who have put a lot of really good economic resources up here in the Cooperative Extension website. But any of these sites will help you keep track of what's happening with the economic impacts. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Dr. Fang.
Well, thank you, Jennie, for this wonderful introduction. Jennie, I think we're hearing a feedback. You might have to mute.
Okay, let's see if I can get myself to do that here real quickly.
Perfect. All right. So again, thank you, Dr. Popp, for this wonderful introduction on the bigger picture of the economy. In the next 25 minutes, I'm going to talk about the impact specifically on consumers like you and I, and a lot of the experiences you might have firsthand experiences with a lot of the things I will be talking about. And I will also talk about how the COVID might have worsened the inequality issues that's already existing in the United States. So next slide, please. All right, so the impact on consumers can be generalized in three categories. So what's interesting we see here is we have two types of behaviors that are kind of contradicting each other. So on the one hand, when they are in a recession, they involve in a recession-like behaviors, including switching to value brands, increase in private labels, prefer cost-value products, and decrease food services, which could reduce consumption overall. But on the other hand, in the face of a crisis, people also stockpile. They buy in bulk, they buy more in volume than they could consume, which could increase actually the consumption. And what we see more than any time in the history is we've got a big boost in e-commerce, online shopping, and food delivery. And so that is kind of the new normal we're looking at. Data in Italy has shown even after Italy has gradually opened up, there's still increasing online shopping continue after the open up. So we might be looking at the same trending in the United States as well. So in terms of recession-like behaviors, if you look at the last recession, which is a financial crisis in 2008 and 2009, there has been evidence of slow resumption of dining out and slow adoption of out-of-home service, including hair and salon care, as well as where cash-strapped consumers will be looking for discounts and cutting coupons. So these are all very similar to what we're seeing right now. So in the next slide, we're going to look at the stockpile. Now, because different countries are at different points in this crisis, for example, Italy is about 3 weeks ahead, and France and Spain is about 2 weeks ahead of the rest of Europe. And what's interesting here is the stockpiling behavior actually start about 2 weeks before the major lockdown events. For example, on March the 11th, the US banned all the travel from Europe. On March the 9th, Italy closed down all non-essential activities. And on March the 15th, Germany closed the borders and closed the schools. So if you see on the graph, the stockpiling behaviors is actually in anticipation of those major policy lockdowns. So that shows consumers forward-looking. Their behaviors are not only guided by the policy, but also guided by their own expectation. So the question will be, what do people actually stockpile on, which we'll see in the next slide. So this is a percentage change in sales for the same time period compared to a year ago. So in terms of non-edibles, the paper products, which a lot of us have seen firsthand, have increased dramatically compared to the same period last year, and is followed by home care, such as cleaning products. And under the category of edible, frozen food increased about 90% compared to the same period next year, followed by packaged food. And there's no surprise, alcohol consumption also increased drastically compared to the year before. All right, so luckily, the stockpiling behavior doesn't last long, as we can see in the next slide. By the end of March and beginning of April, things have kind of calmed down and come back to normal. However, we've seen, this is a quote from the IRI website, which is also in the reading list. So for the first time, we've seen the single week US multi-outlet food sales topped 24.8 billion. So this is the sales per week. And that roughly translates into about a 60% increase compared to the same period last year. All right, so next slide. So if we compare the three period, the pre-stock up, post-stock, peak stock up, and post-stock up, there's no surprise we see the number of trips per buyer increase during stock up, and that we can be categorized into non-edibles and edibles, and it's increase for both categories. However, in terms of dollars spent per trip, there's not much difference for non-edibles. However, there's a significant increase for edible items, such as produce, food. So that's also not surprising. And we'll talk about this more later in the next slide. So this is a typical basket based on the data collected by the IRI, and that's a representative nationwide data set. So if we look at the bottom 3 bars, so they are pre-stock up, peak stock up, and post-stock up. So in terms of non-edibles, there's not much of a difference in terms of the distribution. However, we see an increase in fresh food during the peak stock up, and the trend continues even after stock up. All right, so some other thoughts on consumer behaviors. Next slide, Jenny. Is if we can click on the dashboard, which gives us the most recent data on a lot of fronts. So do people actually eat healthy when they are living through a pandemic? So it could be on the one hand, building a strong immune system is going to help you combat this virus. On the other hand, when people are during a recession, they tend to be more frugal, so they might not be able to afford the healthy food, which are often more expensive. So what we see here is a demand index, and it's a standard metric for tracking changes in spending on consumer packaged goods. So it's a weekly change in consumer purchases by dollar sales against the year ago period across departments, including fixed and random based produce, as well as groceries and other retail format. So the threshold is 100. If we see a number that's bigger than 100, then there's an increased sales. If it's lower, then it's a decreased sales. If we look at the fresh foods category, which is on the bottom of this graph, yes. So the fresh fruits demand actually ticked down a little bit from previous week, with seafood still going very strong. It's accelerating strongly, and drastically different from the year before. And the meat demand is also going up strongly, with no surprise with the news on meat industry, but it's actually a little down from last week. So the other two food items that is very high on the demand are smoked ham and fresh turkey. All right, so that leads to my next question. With the supply shortage that Dr. Popp was talking about, do we see a shortage in supply? Well, based on the data collected by IRI, which we're going to move to the next panel. So this panel shows you the price inflation. So we've all learned about basic economics. There's demand and there's a supply. If demand is higher than supply, then price will go up. So do we see that actually? And the idea is what you're looking at is a price per unit metric, and the threshold again is 100. If the indices is smaller than 100, then we see a deflation in price. If it's bigger than 100, it's an inflation in price. So unfortunately, we do see a little bit of inflation in price across all categories. However, the magnitude is not as high. So overall, I would say we do not see a lot of inflation, and the price is quite stable, which is what we want to see. Now, the next panel, we're going to see the supply shortage. And the threshold for the supply shortage is actually 90%. So if you see a number that's smaller than 90%, it means the supply has declined. And what we see is, unfortunately, we've seen a shortage of supply across board for almost all categories except for beauty products, which is also no surprising because the consumption of cosmetics is going down since everybody is under lockdown. So another thing I want to also touch on is social media. Again, now more than ever, which is the last panel. Jenny, that will be the last panel. Yes. So because of the social media, Twitter, Facebook, and the multiple news outlets, consumers could get signals of the market well ahead of the events actually happening. For example, when hear about the news on workers in the meat industry falling sick, a lot of consumers' reaction was to go to the market and buy pork. So what we've seen from this pandemic is social media plays an important role in connecting information to consumers, and panic buying induces more panic buying. When you hear about the shortage in toilet paper on the news, you go and buy more toilet paper, which intensifies this situation. And the majority who shared opinions are males, and young adults and middle-aged group are leading the discussion on social media. So if you scroll down this panel, you see some of the statistics. And also the positive views reveals around helping communities in this trying time, and the negative views involves around politics and government. All right, so next I'm going to talk about a study on stimulus check. So as Jenny just mentioned, we in the CARES Act, individuals of lower income particularly could receive a stimulus check. So what is a stimulus check? It's a cash payment to a household to stimulate consumption. And because of this shutdown, we have started to see a drastic increase in unemployment and decline in economic activity by mid-March. So a stimulus check is not a novel idea. In 2001, when we have an economic recession that impacted Europe and the United States for about 8 months, the government issued stimulus check, and it's about $300 per individual and about $600 per couples. In 2008, when we had the financial crisis, couples could receive a stimulus check of $1,200 and additional of $300 for each dependent child. So in 2020, the amount of stimulus check is $1,200 per individual and $2,400 per couple, and each dependent child could receive up to $500. And of course, this is restricted to a certain household income level. And if your income level goes up, you're not eligible to as much stimulus check. So some researchers from NBER has collected bank account transaction data in April. That's when the first stimulus check was issued. So they gather information on about 5,700 users, and they look at their consumption behaviors after receiving the check. So some brief conclusion is that prior to receiving the check, a typical individual in this sample spent about 100 a day, and after receiving the check, and they increase their consumption to 120, and this increase continues up to many days after the recipient, after the receipt, and with the majority happen in the 10 days following the receipt of the check. So the next slide tells us in what categories they actually spend the check on. And the caption for the first two graphs cut off. I apologize for that. So for the top left is food, top right is household goods, bottom left is durables, whereas bottom right is non-durables. So durables are car-related spendings, furniture, electronics, whereas non-durables are services, rent payment, loans, mortgage, etc. So as we can see, there is an increase in spending on all four categories, given the check. So we found statistically significant increase in spending for food, household goods, durables, and non-durables. And these responses are widely distributed with about approximately $50 to $75 in the 3 days following the receipt of a check. The durable spending sees a significant increase, but is much smaller in economic terms, with only about a $20 relative increase in spending during the first 3 days. And we see the biggest spending for food and for mortgage payment, which is the food is the top left panel, and the mortgage payment is the bottom right panel. That is not surprising again. So, so overall, for each dollar of stimulus received, households spent about 25 to 35 more in the day and the 9 days following the stimulus check. And this is important because this is what we see as a spillover effect. So the idea of a stimulus check is to encourage people to spend more. And based on this one study, when you issue a direct payment to consumers, not only they spend the money right away, they also spend a little more. And that would create a ripple effect to boost the economy, which is exactly what we want with the stimulus check. What they also observe is individual who has less than $500 in their savings account spend almost half of their payment within the 10 days. Well, this is not observed for people who have more than $3,000 in their bank account. So with this, we can see how the most impact on the stimulus check is for people who don't previously have a lot of savings. So there was a lot of discussion on whether or not we should be bailing out individuals, families, or we should be bailing out big industries. And I'm sure it's important to bail out both of them. But given this study, we see direct evidence that if you bail out family, the money got put right back into the economy right away with a little more. So this is good evidence that the checks works, and in the future it will be beneficial to continue the stimulus check. All right, so my second half of the talk is going to be about inequality. As we all know, the COVID has disproportionately impacted people from different racial background, income, and underlying conditions. So no surprise, the first aspect of inequality comes with income. So the next slide is actually a survey done by the IRI on about 963 households, and about 40% of lower income people has responded that they have difficulty affording groceries, whereas only 10%, 11% of upper income families have responded yes to this question. And the next slide. So a lot of economists have looked into how the social safety net could, the role of the social safety net in this recession. And to quote directly from some researchers, the current pandemic is exposing the inadequacy of our social safety net for the most disadvantaged Americans. Stay-at-home orders, loss of work, and their implication for declines in income require responsive government action. It is urgently necessary to expand the available programs, perhaps increase SNAP benefits, as was done in the 2009 stimulus, and eliminating all work requirement to meet this challenge. So there are a lot of safety nets programs. For example, the unemployment benefits is one of them. Tax credit is another one. And because we're living through a public health crisis, I want to talk about some of the programs that are specifically geared towards nutrition and health for low-income individuals. So next slide, please. All right, so the biggest nutrition program is the Supplemental Nutrition System program, or the formal food stamps. And SNAP is entitlement program. That means it's automatically, if you're eligible, then you're automatically enrolled in SNAP. So SNAP eligibility is income. In general, it's people who are below 130% of the federal poverty guidelines are eligible for SNAP, and it's the single biggest safety net for nutrition. Approximately 9% of American households obtained SNAP at some time during 2017. And among this, about 16.7% of all children living in households that have received SNAP benefits. So to put the eligibility in perspective, in Arkansas, the annual income level limits for a family of 4 would be $33,000. And SNAP is in some way a supplemental income. So recipients would receive a card. It's called an EBT card, and their benefit would automatically get put into that EBT card monthly on a different date. And this is to reduce stigma towards people who are on SNAP. SNAP is wonderful in this time because people who have lost employment would actually see an increase in their benefits. But this is not true for other programs. And this is because other programs are not an entitlement program. So the second program I want to talk about is a special supplemental nutrition policy for women, infants, and children. And by the title, this program is specifically for women who are pregnant or postpartum, infants and children up to 5 years old. So if we go down 2 slides, you will see a picture of empty shell with a VIC label on it. So this was taken during a stockpile period when people are panic buying and hoarding foods. And because VIC benefits is unlike SNAP, it's not a cash payment to a card. It's actually a coupon which specify what kind of food you can buy. And with VIC, you can only buy healthy food. So when everybody else is panic buying and hoarding food, this poses a additional threats to people who are on VIC, because now they're not able to use their benefit, even though they have their benefits available. There is no product available that they could purchase. And some other issues with SNAP recipients is the closing of clinics. VIC recipients. So VIC is not just a nutrition program that gives food. It also provides education. It also provides health referrals. And normally, the recipient would have to come in, get education and at a local clinic. But with the closing of clinic and the disruption in transportations, those who receive VIC will be more at risk. All right, so the next program, if we can go back to 2 slides before, is the school programs. And the National School Lunch Programs operates in about 100,000 public and nonprofit private schools. And it's in 2012, it provides nutritional balance, low cost or free lunch to about more than 31 million children. And free lunch is categorized as a household income of 130% poverty line, whereas reduced lunch is below 185 poverty line. So for many children, the school lunch programs are the major sources of food obtained at school. And there has been direct evidence that children who received nutritious school lunch behave better academically, and they have less behaviors issue. So now with interaction of COVID, school are not in session anymore, and these children have no place to get school food. And as a response, there's a pandemic EBT for families who have children previously enrolled in school lunch programs, and their schools are not in session. So it's roughly about $110 per child that got deposited into the family EBT card. However, there's an issue with this. When children get their food from school, it's required to be meeting a specific nutrition requirement. However, when we deposit the same amount into the family's EBT, it's up to the family to purchase the food. So in this sense, the nutrition quality of the food might be compromised at home compared to when children were getting the food from school. On the other hand, in the family, people share food, so there's no guarantee this amount will go to the children specifically. So with that, I also want to talk about the inequality in food access, which is the next slide. Okay, so that will be the next slide, Jenny. All right, so the insufficient fruits and vegetable consumption have been linked to chronic disease such as diabetes, obesity, and cancer. So those conditions have been linked to more severe COVID disease. And a food desert is defined as not having access to a supermarket within 1 mile in the urban area or a 10-mile in the rural area. Rural residents are particularly face this hardship because about 16% of rural residents live in food deserts. So how does that translate into Arkansas? If we can open the link. So this is a study I have done for different projects. So if we put the county marks on the map, these are all the counties in Arkansas. And if we also put the urban and rural food deserts in Arkansas, as you can see, we have quite a few of food deserts in both urban area and rural areas. So we will talk about the retailers' response to the demand. However, for people who live in food deserts, by definition, they do not have access to a supermarket. So it's harder for them to get groceries from stores. What they could do is they could utilize the farmers market. We're in the summer and the farmers market are operating, and farmers market is good in one of 2 ways. 1, farmers market could be located in food deserts. 2, farmers market, the supply of farmers market are small farmers and who are also seeing a hardship due to this COVID. So if we overlay all the markets for Arkansas in 2017, these are all the farmers market in Arkansas. And some of them take what we call a double up food bags. This is a program that matching dollars spent on produce, which is to encourage consumption of fresh produce. So if we do all the double up markets, we're down to a few that could serve in farmers market and encourage fresh produce. And if we want to look at specifically what low income area we want to serve, that would be the last bar here. So if we want to see how many markets could serve areas that has 2,000 low income people, and this is a list of the market. So all in all, I think policymakers should be looking at using farmers market amid this crisis to meet the nutritional needs of people who do not otherwise have access to supermarket. All right. So my last point will be the inequality on gender. So the inequality on gender is a little different from previous recession. In the 2008 and 9 recession, we've seen men being influenced more strongly, but this is not the case during the current recession. And that has to do with 3 things: tightly communicate, critical industry, and child care. So tightly communicate, based on this research, about 28% of male workers is able to telecommute, but only about 22% of female workers is able to telecommute. So in that case, more men than women can easily adapt to the changed work environment, and women are more likely to lose their employment because of telecommute. And the second point is being critical industry. So if we go to the next slide, those are the one after, I'm sorry. So those are the industries. Yes, so those are the industries that are considered critical industries. That includes transportation, healthcare, of course, retailing. So people who, men are disproportionately more involved in this industry, in the critical industry, whereas women are not. So that put a negative effect on women. And my third point is about child care. So about 40% of Americans, married couple in single families, about 12% are single mother families, only 5% are single father families. So in the face of the shortage of child care, when schools are shut down, single mothers would have to find replacement of their child care in order to go back to labor force. So altogether, those 3 factors have contributed to women being impacted more than men. But on the other hand, there's some good news that the COVID might actually narrow the gender gap between men and women. And that has to do with, first, there's more flexible work arrangement for men and women altogether. So the fathers in the family now could share more of the household chores and the child care. And second of all, there's about half of the doctors are women. A majority of the nurses are women. So they serve as great role models, which might have changed the dynamic in social norms. So with those, we could actually see a decrease in gender gap during this COVID. And I think I went over a few minutes, and my apologies. I'll hand over the floor to John.
Thank you very much. I hope I'm as clear as you two have been. I'm going to take a slightly different tack. I'm moving a little bit from economy more back towards health. But first of all, I couldn't resist starting with what might be a simple lesson in economics. Those of you who are economists will of course know about externalities, but the rest of the world, those of you unfortunate enough not to have studied economics, you may not know externalities. And social distancing, which we've all become quite familiar with in recent weeks, is an excellent example for economists of something called a positive externality. Let me first of all explain what I'm referring to by social distancing. Social distancing in the context of the UK has taken the form of instructing individuals to stay at home unless they're going out to buy food or buy medicine, or also unless they're going out for their one allowable trip outside for physical exercise. If you do go outside, you're expected to stay 2 meters away from any other person. Now, social distancing can take different forms in different countries, but that's the form it's taken in the UK. Now, describing social distancing as a positive externality, what I'm referring to here is the idea that when one individual or household socially distances, they'll gain a benefit. They're protecting themselves by reducing their risk of infection, but they're also generating a benefit for other people. So it's not just reducing their own risk, they're reducing other people's risk. And so there's an external effect, and it's a positive external effect in this context. You're producing a benefit for other people. Now, why externalities are so important for economists is that while we usually are very happy if individuals choose what to do, we tend to think of individuals as the best judges of their own welfare, the best judges of what is good for them. When we've got a positive externality, we have a problem, because many individuals or households, in deciding how closely they're going to adhere to social distancing, many of them will only think of the benefit to themselves, the reduced risk of infection to themselves, to their family. They won't think by socially distancing they are conferring a benefit on other people. And so as a consequence, economists would predict, when we have a positive externality, that individuals left to their own devices and their own choices will tend to produce too little or consume too little social distancing. Now, it's really nice to have this example to talk about, because in the past we've always talked about things like vaccinations. And the idea being that individuals may underinvest in vaccination because they think only of benefits themselves, they don't think of benefits to others. So it's rather nice as economists and health economists to have a new example. Next slide, please. I now want to move to another concept that economists sometimes use, and this is social capital. Now, social capital has a number of different definitions, but is generally referring to the relationship between individuals and the shared norms, the shared values that groups of individuals have. What's this got to do with padlocks attached to a fence? Well, these padlocks are representing particular relationships where individuals have some shared values. Usually these are couples who have wanted to demonstrate their shared commitment by attaching a padlock and leaving it to rust, unlike the relationship. Now, social capital has been important in the context of COVID-19 and attempts to battle with the virus, and particularly in the UK, the government as a policy has worked very hard to exploit an existing relationship that the public have with the health services. Some of you may know that in the UK, we have what's described as a national health service. Now, that's one particular way of organising your health services. The implication is, or a number of implications, is that we all have the same healthcare provider, as it were. Indeed, it's a tax finance system, so we don't pay anything for this health service directly. We just fund it through taxes, and then we share in the services of the NHS. And during this crisis, the government has repeated a message again and again that you must stay at home, protect the NHS and save lives. This mantra, stay at home, protect the NHS and save lives, is exploiting, in the nicest sense, the existing relationship that individuals and communities have with their health services. More than this, government has tried very hard to encourage people to think of others, to think not just of their wider family, but also to think of vulnerable groups in society and those who might be particularly hard hit in health and economic terms as a consequence of this particular pandemic. Next slide, please. Now, here's some illustrations of the marketing, branding. What have we got here? Well, here's one of the messages. Coronavirus, stay home to help us save lives. Another one, and we see it all over the place on electronic billboards, is a sort of collective thank you to our heroes. And our heroes are frontline workers, many of them healthcare workers, others people who stack shelves in supermarkets, people who keep the economy going. They are particularly vulnerable to the virus, whereas the rest of us, many of us, can do our jobs in the comfort and relative safety of our own homes. The giraffe here didn't get any say in whether it wanted to be exploited to advertise the NHS, but this particular photograph, it's a local zoo, is symbolic of this love of the NHS that the public is exhibiting and the government is happy to exploit. That blue and white NHS heart I found it on the side of a building site where clearly someone had taken the time to carve out wooden letters, attach them to the fence and carefully paint them. This is just typical of what's been going on. I'll give you two more examples. Almost any household that's got a child in it, in the window, they've got rather badly drawn rainbows. And inside the rainbow, or underneath the rainbow, it says, "Thank you, NHS," or "NHS, we love you." Thursday nights at 8 p.m, a very high percentage of the population open their window and start clapping or beating pans, pots and pans together, making noise. And this is a gesture of thanks to all these healthcare workers. Next slide, please. Now I want to move on to the broader public health interventions that have been used in trying to battle with this in this pandemic. You might wonder what it's got to do with all these characters with moustaches. Well, of course, you will remember Movember, just as an example. Public health interventions take a very wide range. The public health interventions that have primarily been used in the context of coronavirus have partly been advice, and so all over the place we see messages reminding people to hand wash, and a particular strong theme has been use soap, but use it for 30 or 20 seconds. Wash your hands before you leave your house, wash your hands when you return to house, so on. Other advice has been about self-isolation. If you've got any symptoms, immediately self-isolate. Indeed, try and isolate yourself from members of your own household, which for most individuals is rather challenging. Another public health intervention has been around personal protection equipment. Now in the UK, the policy there has been to try and supply PPE, as it's known, to healthcare workers and not to the public. But policy is just changing recently, and encouragement is if you're going to travel on public transport, please use face masks and so on. Social distancing, I've mentioned already, restrictions on travel, work and non-work activity. Then we might get to what we might see as more readily identifiable public health interventions, such as test, track and trace. The idea being you could test individuals for whether they have the virus, and the track element is you are tracking individuals to see if they've been in proximity to individuals who subsequently test positive, and you're tracing them and letting them know that they may have been exposed to the virus. The importance of this is that individuals may be positive but asymptomatic and potentially spreading the virus without knowing it. And in due course, we all hope that we'll get to a more traditional public health intervention, and that of vaccination. Now, all these different interventions, from an economic point of view, could be compared. They could be compared in terms of what is the additional cost of the intervention compared to what we're currently doing, and what's the additional benefit. But if we're going to try and measure the additional benefit, we have to think, what is it we're trying to achieve with our public health interventions? Next slide, please. In other words, I apologise for some of the illustrations being so literal. What's our goal, or our goals? What should health policy with respect to coronavirus be trying to achieve? Now, the first candidate might be, well, should we try and minimise the death rate? Currently, as a consequence of the virus, death rates have gone up. Should we be looking at policies to try and reduce the death rate? Now, that's a possibility, because obviously fewer deaths is better. But is it really deaths that we worry about? Should we perhaps be seeking to maximise survival? In other words, how long people live. Now, the difference between these two is quite important, particularly in the context of coronavirus, where there's a very strong age relationship, and in the country, the bulk of the deaths have been concentrated in older age groups, and the older you are, the higher your risk of death. Now, if you prevent the death of a very old person, you do not add a great deal to expected survival. If you prevent the death of a younger person, you add more to expected survival. So if you're going to maximise survival, you may put more effort into somewhat younger age groups rather than older age groups. But really, is that all we care about? Do we just care about how long people live? Well, surely not. We are concerned also with the nature of that survival. And one example in health economics of how we've tried to allow for this is by using a construct called quality adjusted life years. So in other words, we compare health interventions in terms of how many years of life, additional years of life, these interventions will give us, but we quality adjust those years of life to take into account the idea that surviving in considerable pain is not as valuable to the individual as surviving for the same period, but not in pain, for example. On the other hand, is this sort of goal, this health-focused goal, is this really the most appropriate way to evaluate different policies? As economists, should we perhaps not be trying to maximise utility or the general well-being of individuals? Next slide, please. Now this illustration here, it was a photograph I took on an advert I saw on the street in Berlin a few years ago. It actually immediately made me think of my daughter when I saw it. But what it's trying to bring home is the idea, yes, we value health, but that's not the only thing in life we value. It's an important input to our well-being, but it's not everything. Should we be taking a much broader view of what individuals value, and therefore taking their overall well-being and the change in their future well-being into account? Now, this is where we come back to the economy, because if we spend longer periods socially distancing, if we have more restriction on economic activity, we may have a beneficial impact on health, but individuals lose out in other spheres. As we've seen in a lot of data this afternoon, many individuals are unemployed. Some individuals, their incomes are cut so much they have difficulty obtaining satisfactory nutrition. Now, I'm not saying it would be easy to do, but in principle, we could look at the policies to control SARS-CoV-2, the virus that causes COVID-19, and those policies and future economic activity. We've seen quite a few statistics today and graphs that show the big hit that economic activity has taken and the generally relatively slow adjustment expected in the future as we return to our traditional growth path. We could try and establish that link, and more than that, we could look at the link between that future economic activity and the future health of the population. And this broader perspective might be a more appropriate one. There's a danger that in the short run, we're reducing our health losses with things like social distancing and restrictions on economic activity, but we're storing up problems for the future because the more limited economic activity in the future as a consequence of our current policies will impact on future health. Next slide, please. Now, this is in fact the last slide I have. This character, I could say, lives around the corner from me. He's a little bit damaged over time, but what he's demonstrating here, in one hand, he's got his sack of money, and the other hand, he's trying to hold on to his heart or his health. And he's being pulled apart. In fact, literally, he seems to have dropped off. Parts of his leg has dropped off already. Is there a relationship, indeed a trade-off, between health and the economy? Now, a lot of the messaging in the UK from the government has been, oh, it's not a trade-off. Health comes first, and we must focus on health. In some other countries, if anything, and one reading of the US, and apologies as an outsider if it's a misreading, one reading of the US is there's large sections of the US population and government who think that really we should try and get the economy back working, and that will contribute much more to well-being than maintaining restrictions on economic activity in order to slow down the spread of the virus. The question is, what are the trade-offs? And one way of phrasing the trade-off at its most direct would be to say, how many person weeks of lockdown do we need to have per COVID-19 death avoided? How many person weeks of lockdown do we need to avoid one more COVID-19 death? Well, I don't know the answer, but in principle, you could work out an average figure for this. It might be 20,000, who knows? Question then is that a price worth paying? Is the degree of restriction on the economic activity and the future problems that might generate, is that a price worth paying, a cost worth incurring in order to save an additional COVID-19 death now? And I believe that's my last slide. Thank you, Jenny.
All right. Thank you very much to our three economists for that incredibly informative, somewhat disturbing overview of what's going on and sort of situating it also in a political context. That was fantastic. Really, really appreciate it.